It's obviously a great pleasure to return to Leeds. It's a great city with a great history, and it's one not just of our country's economic centres, but one of Europe's. And as we enter now this year of 2016, it is a good opportunity to look back and to look at how the devolution agenda has come, how far it's come in recent years. 3 years ago, my report, to which you referred, No Stone Unturned in Pursuit of Growth, advocated a radical reinvigoration of all parts of England by shifting more of the decisions that affect local people to those people. And in essence, the simple but right answer to the question, when it comes to the north, who knows best? The answer is you, who live and work here. You know best. And it's been my privilege during a long career in both government and the private sector to have been involved in economic regeneration during much of that time. I joined the cabinet in 1979, although I had been through the experiences as a junior minister to which you referred. I was Secretary of State for the Department of the Environment. My Labour predecessor, Peter Shaw, had established the urban programme. It was an admirable attempt to address the problems of urban deprivation, and his scheme simply consisted of topping up the grants available in the normal process of distribution to the poorest local authorities, which then allowed them to spend more on key transport, housing, environmental and educational programmes. Many ministers change the arrangements they inherit, but my first act in the department in 1979 was not to abolish the urban programme, but to refocus it and, I hope, improve it. And in essence, I introduced just one new condition, and that is that in the use of the money, local authorities had to work in partnership with the private sector. Across the country, we encouraged local authorities to talk to the private sector and work out what investment the grant, this extra grant, could unlock. So private house builders came forward and offered to build houses if the public sector would bear the expense of clearing derelict land. The money was spent more wisely and helped to attract extra investment from the private sector. And in doing that, we established the concept of gearing. Even more important, we broke down many of the human barriers between the public and private sectors, and indeed within the public sector itself. Against opposition from many sources, in 1981, we set up the London Docklands Development Corporation to regenerate the Isle of Dogs. The LDDC was a partnership in practice between local leaders, the leaders of the local boroughs, and key figures from the private sector. Under the leadership of Nigel Brokes and Reg Ward, we gave the LDDC a limited amount of public money, the ownership of derelict land, and powers over planning. I don't really need to go into any depth about what happened next. Canary Wharf, the Excel Exhibition Centre, the Docklands Light Railway, City Airport, and a massive expansion of new freehold housing. And that regeneration, based on public-private partnership, was seen up and down the country throughout the next 15 years. Indeed, here in Leeds, later in the 1980s, the Development Corporation had its own successes with the Royal Armouries, the Centenary Footbridge, the Hunslet Green Housing Development, and Asda's headquarters. On top of the many housing, transport, and commercial development successes, over 9,000 new jobs were delivered, thanks to the injection of £350 million of private sector investment. The Development Corporation in Liverpool, set up much the same time as in London in '79, is another example. We began work, including the listing of the Albert Dock, the preparation of the Garden Festival, and the new partnership with the private sector immediately after the 1979 election. Riots in Toxteth broke out in July of 1981, 2 years later, but I felt a personal responsibility, and I asked the Prime Minister to release me for 2.5 weeks to visit the city, meeting the locals, talk about the root causes of the disquiet and what they thought could be done to turn the city around. I walked the city's streets, met local businessmen, local leaders, and other members of the community, and they all had their own ideas on what needed to be done. Virtually all of the lists they produced was about what somebody else should do. Over the next few weeks, we built up a list of projects that we could take forward in order to demonstrate that actually it was possible for things to happen in Liverpool. I will never forget my home for those 2.5 weeks, a room on the 16th floor of the Atlantic Tower Hotel. From there, the views were astonishing. The Mersey flowed as it had done through eternity, although the boats that had once shipped cotton, tea, sugar from across the globe had long gone, and the historic Albert Docks were 10 years closed. From my window, I could also see the great skyline of Victorian and Georgian architecture, its beauty hiding the deprivation and desperation that many living below it had experienced for decades. The buccaneers of the Industrial Revolution, who had created our great cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, Newcastle, Leeds, and many others, they had left an indelible stamp. Their wealth had not only transformed the way we worked, but it had transformed the way we lived. The living conditions of the people were increasingly unacceptable. Democratic concern had led to an increasingly centralized response as social amelioration replaced wealth generation as the local priority. The buccaneers gave way to a world of officialdom under ministers and councillors. Ministers and mandarins in London decided what was best for those cities with little dialogue between them. Local entrepreneurs had been replaced by formulation and formulae from London. So what lessons emerged for me for all these experiences? First, the importance of place. Put simply, you cannot make decisions about people and places they live in without speaking to the people themselves. And to talk to those people, to make them confident that they are involved in the decisions that affect them. I understand that the IPPR and the RTPI have conducted a series of roundtables, indeed today as an example, throughout the northern cities, and I very much salute that approach. Any plan for the region must be designed by the people who live and work in it. Second, in the age-old debate as to whether the public sector or the private sector knows best, the answer is neither. The best solutions are arrived at where the knowledge, skills, experience, and expertise of both are harnessed to draw up ideas together. I have always seen Whitehall as the custodians of quality and the creators of opportunity. The owners of ideas and the delivery of those ideas are found largely within local communities. Third, public money can be spent to incentivize the private sector to spend too. Never has this been so important as the country continues to go through a period of restraint in public expenditure. We simply need to get more bangs for each buck. My ministerial career came to an end in 1997, and for 10 years I returned to the private sector until David Cameron became leader of my party and asked me to revisit this agenda. First, together with Sir Terry Leahy, we set out a 20-year vision for Liverpool. Times had certainly changed. Everyone to whom we talked in Liverpool had ideas, but this time they wanted to lead the process of change. No one would have believed in 1981 that 30 years later that city would be housing a successful series of festivals for Britain, attracting thousands of people. In 2012, building on that report's thrust, the Prime Minister asked me to conduct an independent review into UK competitiveness. My report, No Stone Unturned in Pursuit of Growth, revolved around these key themes of involving local places in decisions that affect them, of the importance of government and the private sector working hand in hand, and of using public money to secure private finance. The central recommendation was devolution, the long overdue return of this country to its 19th century dynamics that had made it the world leader of the Industrial Revolution. The devolution agenda, which the government is pursuing, now affects a growing range of public life. In 2010, the government created 39 local enterprise partnerships. In many ways, they reflected the recommendations of the 1960s Redcliffe Maud report covering the same territory. From a slow start, the local enterprise partnerships are a growing success and are now an essential feature of the devolution agenda. Also in 2010, the government launched the Regional Growth Fund, aimed at increasing private sector employment in those communities that were most affected by the reductions in public expenditure. The RGF placed particular emphasis on plans that levered in large amounts of private cash, with the consequence that £5.50 was promised by the private sector for every pound of public money that they requested. The following year, Greg Clark launched the first wave of city deals, devolving powers and responsibilities to England's 8 largest cities. Whitehall and those cities worked together to determine what they needed from government. In 2011, the government announced the introduction of the first new enterprise zones, with local councils in those areas working with business to create jobs and growth on some of the country's most derelict sites. So far, 42 new enterprise zones have been set up. The establishment of the Local Growth Fund in 2013 set up a single pot of growth money for local places to bid into to fund their local growth priorities. The money was previously hypothecated into different specialist government departments. We drew a great deal of it back into a single pot and invited bids. In January 2015, the government announced 39 growth deals, one with each local enterprise partnership, committing £7.7 billion from that local growth fund to transport, skills and local infrastructure projects across England. But the true game changer has been full-scale devolution. Late in the last Parliament, the Chancellor announced an historic agreement with the local leaders of Manchester. They agreed to form a combined authority with a new, directly elected mayor in return for responsibilities handed back to them not handed back to them, they had never had those responsibilities before. Since the election, the present government has made big strides with devolution, agreeing deals with Cornwall, Sheffield, Tees Valley, the North East, Liverpool and the West Midlands. There is now virtually the whole of the north of England and the West Midlands covered by devolved authorities, to be led by mayors, which then adds, of course, to Tony Blair's long-standing creation of the London mayoralty. Now, of course, I'm aware that whilst agreement has been reached for combined authorities, deals extensively across the north of England, such agreement has not yet proved possible here in Leeds or much of Yorkshire. The government's position is clear. They're not going to impose a solution. All of us recognise and understand the human and historic tensions involved in finding common ground between neighbouring or different types of local authority. It would be just the same in the private sector or in Whitehall itself. Imposing an inevitably controversial solution can lead to a simmering mood of discontent. The government is concerned to avoid such a background as the backdrop to its determination to share power more widely. If I inject a personal note, I very much hope that local leaders will look to the opportunities on offer, put traditional and parochial loyalties on one side, and take their rightful place at the heart of the revolution of devolved power now engaging our country. Let us be clear, no local authority loses any of their existing powers. Nothing is taken away from anyone. Government is offering to give up or share some of its powers. In return, it asks local government to work closely with the wealth-creating companies to create a framework of cooperation, enabling local authorities to work together effectively and in respect of the powers that they, the government, are giving up to elect one directly elected person, the mayor, to administer them. That is what has been widely agreed across the North. It is a fair deal and it is a good one. The threats and the opportunities that we face are not in the boroughs of Leeds or in the villages of Yorkshire. They're in the export markets of the world, in the competitiveness of our economy, in the quality of services we provide for our people, and in the local leadership that is within our grasp. Now, some dismiss the Northern Powerhouse as a slogan. This government's relentless drive to make devolution a reality at all costs ought to show those doubters they are most certainly wrong. There is no room for doubt at all that George Osborne has made the project a personal crusade. I have never seen a Chancellor so committed. You have an opportunity without modern precedent. Take Transport for the North, a partnership between all Northern LEPs, the Department of Transport, Network Rail, Highways England and HS2 Limited. The government has given Transport for the North statutory status and asked for it to come up with a long-term transport strategy for the North, including pushing forward with the rollout of contactless ticketing and the prioritisation of options to improve east-west connectivity. Last week, the National Infrastructure Commission, on which I am proud to serve, closed its call for evidence on ideas to improve transport links between northern cities. The Commission itself is an important step forward, delivering a longer-term strategic vision for investment. The Commission could not be under better leadership than that of Andrew Adonis, the man who masterminded Labour's pledge to continue to devolve to local places and the man who set in place the HS2 project. So what does the future look like? The devolution agenda is about to reach the statute book. All over England, a dialogue is taking place about the shape of powers of new combined authorities. We shall see more agreements as local communities grasp the opportunity to achieve so much more. Elections for the new mayors will follow in 2017. By the same timescale, London will have its 5th such mayoral election, helping it to continue to power ahead. We are behind much of the world in our system of local leadership. Our competitors elect mayors because that works. The Chancellor recently announced that local authorities would keep the business rates they rise. The government is reversing the trend of town halls being preoccupied by social provision, and this will encourage town halls to focus more on growth. This is genuinely transformational. Wherever I go now, councillors are talking once again about their local economy. Urban regeneration has been a consistent preoccupation of my political life. I was delighted to be invited by the Prime Minister to return to the complex issue of estate regeneration. Nothing could be more closer to people's interests than that. This week's announcement takes forward one of the most important social revolutions that began with the right to buy in 1980. At the same time, we recreated the private rented sector, which proved a huge contributor to social housing. In the 1990s, we gave tenants the chance to run their own estates. City Challenge eradicated some of the worst slum conditions. All of those policies were controversial and opposed. Today, they are mainstream in the political agenda. And so now the new offer, £140 million of government money to help the regeneration of England's sink estates. Of course, this is not the only source of funding. It is a programme to encourage others to participate. Local authorities, pension funds, housing associations, builders, the third sector, other government departments. There may well also be constraints in the planning process which, if removed or modified, could facilitate change. The fund will be administered by Greg Clark, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and day-to-day oversight will sit with his colleague Brandon Lewis. It will be Greg who chairs the Cabinet Committee that brings together the departments with an interest in this subject across government. This is a great example of devolution. People who live on these estates will define the solution. We will ensure that their questions are answered, their rights protected, and their anxieties addressed. Nothing will be imposed. Communities will propose. So you will say to me, but what will they propose? I don't know. The essence of our scheme is that we don't and can't know. There are plenty of examples of what could happen, such as Woodbury Down in London. It used to be one of the most deprived estates in our capital, but has now been transformed into a thriving and desirable neighbourhood. My job is to chair a panel of people who have experience in estate regeneration to guide this initiative. Invitations are going out and my panel will meet for the first time in February. We need to ensure that the people involved bring experience, of which there is an encouraging amount, but also are credible with the communities with which we will be working. The next step is for appropriate groups or local authorities to put forward their plans for the panel to consider. And we will go further than that. Officials stand ready to help the preparation of proposals, either with advice or, where appropriate, by using their good offices to coordinate the response of government across the horizon that the Prime Minister has drawn. Our hope is to work with 100 estates and ensure that we have projects where current residents agree on a revitalised agenda. But we will not wait for the completion of a list before we start work. Indeed, it may be of help encouraging others if we're able to approve early examples. I have been asked what happens if local communities cannot agree on any plan for us to approve. The short answer is that we're not going to impose any government plan on anyone. We will ensure, if there is a plan, that individuals are compensated for any costs involved in their cooperation. We will enshrine rights to reassure tenants they will be fully protected. I take an optimistic view. Estate regeneration has now been widely practiced. I saw what happened when we converted Cantrell Farm in Knowsley to Stockbridge Village Trust in the 1980s. I saw some of the worst estates in Europe, such as the Hume Estate in Manchester, transformed by City Challenge in the 90s. I believe there is a hunger by local people to take control of their destiny. We will help them, but we will not compel them to do what they do not want. I said we do not and cannot know the nature of the plans that will be proposed. Obviously, housing in its different tenures will be at the heart of any suggestions. The creation of more affordable housing is a prime policy objective, but there are many ways of facilitating this that can only emerge from a study of local circumstance and opportunities. So, I draw to a close. If I am excited by progress in the devolution agenda so far, do I consider that we have completed the job? Certainly not. That is not to criticise the government. I believe they have set in concrete the direction of travel. There is much progress. There is much yet to do. The man who has enjoyed a good lunch is perfectly entitled to ask, what's for dinner. And what would be my rallying call to you? Be bold in your plans. Be radical in your ideas. I believe this to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The government has set in train the most full-scale and radical devolution plans I have witnessed throughout my career. Let us not forget that devolution is not simply about staying ahead of our neighbouring communities. It is about all of us pulling together to keep in front of our global competitors. For the UK to be competitive, each and every part of it must succeed. So enjoy your lunch and start thinking about dinner.